Do you wear cardigans, clout goggles, and have an overall disdain for an actual quality fashion sense? Do you enjoy the sound of cats fighting outside in the middle of the night? Do you have an unhealthy and extremely destructive hatred of musical instruments? Well, it seems like grunge is the perfect genre for you. But what is grunge, and why are so many genres named after materials you find in public toilets and nightclubs? Grunge is a music genre and fashion style that became intrinsically linked to the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s. Musically, grunge is a combination of punk rock, specifically the more American slaphead bold incarnation of punk, and heavy metal, specifically this kind of metal. Although grunge is directly inspired by hardcore punk, it completely removes one of punk's key elements, which is speed. Grunge bands often focus on creating slower, darker, and more ominous riffs, which are often served with unwashed cardigans and ripped jeans, as well as shouty style lyrics that sound akin to your dad telling you off for watching too many YouTube videos and not studying. If you want to make grunge for yourself, here's a little crash course. Take a heavy metal or punk riff, slow it down, play it backwards, distort it and bury it in feedback, and shout lyrics without any melody over the top from your bedroom. Really give your dad a reason to shout at you. But that's just guitar. Of course other instruments exist. Drums are aggressive and primal, much like the genre's counterparts, and bass is layered in distortion and fuzz, with bass lines that oftentimes remain separate from the root notes of the melody, although it's unlikely you'll be able to hear any of it thanks to the feedback and a dude who looks like this wailing over the top. Oftentimes the vocals are very low pitched, which is surprising considering what most of the vocalists look like. This is to match the downtuned guitars and darker themed lyrics. Speaking of lyrics, themes are often dark, nihilistic, and filled with enough angst to permanently blind at least 4 people with this haircut. Lyrics often cover more personal issues such as neglect, isolation, and trauma, although can also portray the anti-establishment messages seen more in punk, although more targeted towards social prejudices certain groups might experience, as well as political issues that more heavily affect young people. Oh yeah, and just one more thing. Before you can become a successful grunge band, one thing you need to remember: make sure anyone who pays to see you lives to regret it by the end of the performance. This can be achieved by sending guitar and drum kit shrapnel into the crowd, or just straight up playing songs wrong on purpose. But how did this genre come to be, and more importantly, how did it become the biggest musical genre on the planet for a good period of time? Before we get into real grunge, we have to explore a few proto-grunge artists. The earliest artists that could be seen as proto-grunge would be the Sonics, who were able to replicate the distorted tone of grunge years before, essentially just through horrendous recording equipment. Some things never change. Other examples of proto-grunge artists making music before the 80s would roll around is Neil Young, who is commonly considered as the godfather of grunge. One band that was more akin to the future sound of grunge would be the Wipers, who would form 100 miles south of Seattle. However, would travel there often, meaning the blueprint they laid for grunge was picked up by many in the area and would come to define the style. One thing that remained pivotal to the development of grunge is the location of Seattle itself. The city had a flourishing music scene, although remained separate and completely isolated from the cities that were defining music at the time. This allowed bands within the city to completely isolate themselves from what everyone else was doing, truly developing a style unique to themselves. This was seen with the grunge pioneers U-Men, who would add a little bit of metal seasoning to their post-punk potion, creating something that's seen by many as not only influencing the sound of the grunge explosion, but the aesthetic too, which is very important as we all know grunge is mainly just men and women simping over this dude. This little post-punk scene in Seattle also included bands like The Accused and The Farts. This scene, alongside elements of hardcore, specifically the slower side being explored by Black Flag, and alternative rock, specifically the mixture of softer and more aggressive sections of songs utilised by the Pixies. Oh, and of course, we can't mention any heavy genre of music without mentioning this dude. In terms of metal, Sabbath and thrash metal would more positively influence grunge, and hair metal would negatively influence grunge. By this, I mean early grunge bands hated hair metal so much that they tried to create music that was the complete opposite. As opposed to the musically bloated and over-the-top elements of hair metal, they created the rawest, most primal music they could think of, which of course is just power chords or screaming over the top. What else? The Seattle post-punk scene was slowly introducing more elements of the previously mentioned influences, creating a more defined grunge. This started with the band Green River, who would release the seminal grunge album in 1985. This would be followed by a compilation released by the Seattle label CZ Records named Deep Six, featuring bands such as Melvins, Soundgarden, Malfunction, Skinyard, U-Men, as well as Green River. Although Green River remains important to the development of the genre, it's the bands that would form out of their breakup that would truly lay their mark. During the split of Green River, 2 groups would form. The ones that wanted to remain underground would form Mudhoney, and the ones who wanted to become rock stars would form Mother Love Bone. This, alongside Soundgarden signing to a major label, represented a shift in the culture and attitude of grunge, which primed it for a more mainstream audience. Unfortunately, the tragic overdose of Mother Love Bone singer would see the end of the band, who would later transform into Pearl Jam. I feel this video is becoming a little bit too informative and in places sad, so here's a quick video of Kurt Cobain jumping into a drum kit. Around this time, this cheeky little alongside bassist Chris Novoselic were looking for a drummer. Cobain would ask his ex-bandmate Buzz Lars Osborne of Melvin's fame. Kurt would find Dave Grohl neatly packaged in a box at his front door, with only a note saying, "Dave was never my friend, signed King Buzzo." This led to the creation of the band that would skyrocket grunge to the mainstream. This band would be Nirvana. Nirvana would first come to the attention of the crusty individuals of Seattle with the release of Bleach in 1989. And although the album cost about as much to record as the average outfit of modern day Cobain fans, and was barely promoted and distributed by its label, it received decent sales for a band of Nirvana's size at the time, and became a hit on college radio. Not long after the small success of Bleach, Dave Grohl would join the band to complete the lineup that led them to international success. Around this time, Nirvana demos were circulating from unwashed hand to unwashed hand, resulting in attention from labels increasing. Due to the deal they had, they were unable to be bought out by another indie label, and were eventually able to sign to a major label thanks to recommendations from members of Sonic Youth. This meant we had fashionable edgelords, money from a major label, and a media that was strangely obsessed with counterculture at the time. This could only lead to success, but what ended up happening still defied expectations. Nevermind would be released in 1991. Originally expected to sell 250,000 copies, it ended up selling 30 million. But how? 3 letters, MTV. The music video for the song Smells Like a Teen Spirit was being consistently played on major television. More mainstream listeners were introduced to a band who had the heaviness, edge and appeal of punk, combined with a more approachable style of music that appealed to listeners of more catchy music. This set off a storm, with many of Nirvana's concerts being dangerously overbooked due to unexpected success. This didn't meld well with, let's say, Cobain's destructive live performances. In the coming months, Nevermind would be consistently played on both mainstream television and radio, eventually displacing Michael Jackson as #1 on the Billboard charts. A weird combination of critical acclaim, perceived edge, a band that was, let's say, visually appealing for television, and a pop appeal had finally brought a genre originally born out of frustration with mainstream rock music to the exact same place, the mainstream. This obviously immediately led to money-grubbing labels trying to find another Nirvana, which sounds bad, however led to many bands who were destined to remain in the underground get signed to major labels. Examples outside of grunge include Melvins and Surfers. This did of course extend heavily to grunge, with frontrunners beforehand such as Soundgarden and Pearl Jam receiving way more attention from fans and industry connections alike, resulting in many grunge albums created by Nirvana's contemporaries selling extremely well. The success of grunge obviously put Seattle on the map as well, which developed both positives and negatives. Positives obviously include: on the flip side, the vast popularity of grunge led to many bands who adopted the genre outside of Seattle being panned and labelled as bandwagoners. Even Seattle itself got sick of grunge, as a pushback began to develop due to over-commercialization of the genre, which was true. The amount of suit-wearing motherfuckers scrambling to find a new Nirvana at the time was ridiculous. This sentiment was also shared by many of the biggest grunge bands, who saw their success as a burden and something that could only dampen their creative vision. Because of this, you'd think Nirvana's follow-up In Utero would dampen down the sound to appeal to their more mainstream audience. This wasn't the case, as In Utero would arguably be heavier than Nevermind. You'd think this would relight the fire in grunge. Unfortunately, it was too late, as the success was not only forcing prominent early adopters like Pearl Jam to retreat from the spotlight, but oversaturating the genre with copycats trying to cash in on grunge. The influx of major label money was watering down and changing the culture that made grunge cool in the first place. The downward spiral of grunge would continue, with many of the prominent bands being plagued with drug addiction. The final nail in the coffin for the grunge explosion of the 90s would be Cobain's death in 1994. The person responsible for the success in the first place was gone, and grunge would slowly be replaced by this, and this for some reason. Although grunge will never reach the heights it did during the early 90s, it has remained a prominent influence on many bands nowadays. Post-grunge has produced some pretty decent bands, as well as some pretty unforgivable bands, but at least grunge has led to grunge gays, and I really like this band. So, although grunge fell back into the underground not long after its explosion into the mainstream, it's a period in music history that remains very important. It taught major labels that there is mainstream appeal for bands who sit within the more alternative, underground space in music, which has allowed many bands to get the attention they deserve who may have remained underground if it wasn't for this dude. If we learn one lesson from this, it's that these sunglasses need to be f***ing stopped, please. Just no more, I don't want to see them anymore.